Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly extraordinary. The medieval cathedrals that took not years, not decades, but centuries to complete. Stone by stone, generation after generation, built by hands that would never see the final vision. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine being a stonemason in 1163. You arrive at a muddy construction site on an island in the Seine River, right in the heart of Paris. The air smells of fresh-cut limestone and sawdust. Around you, wooden scaffolding rises like a skeleton reaching toward heaven. You're told you'll be working on something magnificent, a cathedral dedicated to Notre Dame, Our Lady. Your master mason shows you the plans, intricate drawings on parchment that detail flying buttresses, rose windows and towers that will scrape the sky. He tells you this building will glorify God for 1,000 years. What he doesn't tell you, because he doesn't know, is that you will spend your entire working life here and never see it finished. Your son will work here, your grandson will work here, and even your great-great-grandson might still be carving gargoyles on the roof when he's an old man. This was the reality of medieval cathedral construction. Not a project with a deadline, but a multi-generational act of faith, ambition, and staggering human patience. In the 11th and 12th centuries, something extraordinary swept across Europe. A building boom unlike anything the world had seen since Rome's glory days. It wasn't driven by emperors or warlords. It was driven by bishops, kings, wealthy merchants, and entire towns who wanted to prove one thing. We love God more than you do, and we can prove it with stone. These weren't just churches. These were statements, political declarations, architectural competitions between cities that could last 200 years. If your rival city built a cathedral with a 100-foot nave, you built one with a 120-foot nave. If they added stained glass, you added more stained glass. And if they built twin towers, well, you built twin towers that could be seen from 3 villages away. Pride and piety mixed into a potent cocktail that produced some of humanity's most breathtaking architecture. But it also created projects so ambitious that no single generation could hope to complete them. Let's talk about Cologne Cathedral. Construction began in 1248. The foundation stone was laid with great ceremony. Bishops blessed the site. Choirs sang hymns. Nobles donated gold. Everyone believed this would be the greatest Gothic cathedral in all of Christendom, and then reality set in. By 1500, after 252 years of continuous work, the cathedral still wasn't finished. Not even close. The south tower stood incomplete. The nave lacked its roof. Entire sections existed only as wooden frames. And then, in the 16th century, work stopped entirely. Not because of war, though there was plenty of that. Not because of plague, though that visited often enough, but because people simply lost interest. Priorities shifted. The Protestant Reformation arrived, and suddenly spending a fortune on a Catholic monument felt less appealing. For over 300 years, Cologne Cathedral sat frozen in time, a massive stone skeleton looming over the city. Unfinished, abandoned, a monument to ambition that had outlasted its own purpose. Travellers described it as eerie, walking through a half-built church where weeds grew between the stones and birds nested in unfinished archways. It wasn't until 1842, during a wave of romantic nationalism, that construction resumed, and finally, in 1880, 632 years after it began, Cologne Cathedral was completed. The men who laid the final stone stood on the shoulders of 25 generations who came before them. So what made these projects take so long? It wasn't incompetence. Medieval builders were astonishingly skilled. The real problem was scale. Cathedrals weren't just big. They were impossibly, audaciously, almost offensively big. A single cathedral required tens of thousands of tons of stone. Limestone, sandstone, marble, granite. Each block had to be quarried, shaped, transported and lifted into place. And we're not talking about small blocks. Some weighed as much as a horse. Quarries might be miles away, sometimes dozens of miles away. Stone had to be hauled by ox-drawn carts over roads that turned into rivers of mud every winter. A single cartload might take days to arrive, and once it did, the stone had to be inspected, measured, carved, and fitted with precision. Because unlike modern buildings, cathedrals used almost no mortar in their critical joints. The stones held together by weight, friction, and geometry. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the entire structure could collapse, which, by the way, happened more often than anyone wants to admit. Then there was the workforce. A large cathedral construction site might employ 200 to 400 people at its peak. Stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, blacksmiths, labourers, carters, and apprentices. Each had a specialised role. Each had their own guild, their own rules, their own jealously guarded techniques. A master mason didn't just show up and start carving. He trained for years, often decades, learning geometry, proportion, and the subtle art of reading stone. Because stone isn't uniform. A block of limestone from one layer of the quarry might be soft and easy to carve. A block from 10 feet deeper might be dense as iron. A good mason knew how to look at a stone and see its character, its flaws, its possibilities. They worked slowly, methodically, with tools that hadn't changed much since Roman times. Chisels, mallets, saws, levels, plumb lines. No power tools, no machinery, just hands, eyes, and endless, relentless patience. But here's the thing that made cathedral construction truly unique. The workforce was never stable. Masons travelled constantly, moving from one project to another as work became available. A man might spend 5 years in Paris, then move to Chartres, then to Reims, then back to Paris. These weren't employees in the modern sense. They were itinerant craftsmen, part of an international network that spanned all of Europe. When you hired a mason, you weren't just getting his hands, you were getting his knowledge, his experience, his memories of other cathedrals. This created a strange phenomenon. Cathedrals began to influence each other across vast distances. A technique developed in Amiens might appear in Canterbury a decade later, brought by a mason who worked on both. Ideas flowed through this network like water through channels. Flying buttresses, pointed arches, ribbed vaults. All of these innovations spread because masons carried them in their heads from site to site. And then there was money, or more accurately, the lack of it. Building a cathedral was breathtakingly expensive. Imagine trying to fund a project that will cost more than your city's entire annual revenue. Now imagine doing that for 150 years. Where does the money come from? Everywhere and nowhere. Bishops pledged funds from their dioceses. Kings made grand donations, usually when they wanted to be seen as pious. Nobles contributed, hoping to secure a burial spot inside. Merchants gave generously, knowing that a grand cathedral attracted pilgrims, and pilgrims spent money. Guilds donated windows, each one emblazoned with their symbols. Even peasants contributed, offering a few coins or a day's labour as an act of devotion. But money flowed inconsistently. A wealthy bishop might die and be replaced by someone less generous. A war might drain the treasury. A bad harvest meant fewer donations, so work slowed or stopped entirely. Masons were dismissed. Scaffolding rotted. Rain seeped into half-built walls, freezing in winter and cracking the stone. Years might pass before funds returned and construction resumed. This created a strange rhythm. Cathedrals grew in bursts. A decade of frantic activity followed by years of silence. Then another burst when a new bishop arrived with fresh enthusiasm. Then more silence. Then another push when a local noble died and left his entire fortune to the church. It was less like building a structure and more like watching a glacier move. Slow, inexorable, shaped by forces beyond any individual's control. Now let's talk about the architects, though that word doesn't quite capture what they were. In the medieval world, the man in charge of construction was called the master mason, or master of the works. He wasn't an architect in the modern sense. He was part engineer, part artist, part foreman, and part mystic. Because designing a cathedral wasn't just about making something beautiful. It was about channeling divine order into stone. Medieval builders believed the universe was constructed according to mathematical principles. Proportions, ratios, harmonies. God was the ultimate geometer, and a cathedral was meant to reflect that divine geometry. So master masons didn't just draw plans, they calculated proportions based on sacred numbers. The layout of the cathedral might follow the measurements of Solomon's temple. The height of the nave might be determined by the golden ratio. The placement of columns might align with the positions of saints in heaven. And here's where things get fascinating. These men worked without blueprints, at least not in the way we'd recognise them. There were drawings, yes, sketches on parchment, floor plans scratched into plaster, wooden templates for arches, but nothing like the detailed construction documents we use today. Much of the design existed only in the master mason's head. He carried the vision. He saw the finished cathedral in his mind and guided the work toward that imagined perfection. Which created a significant problem. What happens when the master mason dies? Because remember, these projects lasted centuries. No master mason lived long enough to see his cathedral completed. So when he died, leadership passed to his successor, who might have a completely different vision. The new master might look at the half-built structure and think, this is all wrong. Or he might decide to incorporate newer, more fashionable styles. Gothic architecture evolved constantly. Early Gothic, High Gothic, Rayonnant, flamboyant. Styles change like seasons, and each new master mason brought his own aesthetic preferences. This is why many cathedrals look like architectural patchwork quilts. The eastern end might be Romanesque, built in the 1100s with thick walls and small windows. The nave might be early Gothic from the 1200s, with pointed arches and ribbed vaults. The western facade might be late Gothic from the 1400s, dripping with ornate tracery and soaring spires. Walk through a medieval cathedral, and you're walking through time itself. Each section a snapshot of the era that built it. It's like listening to a song composed over 300 years, where different musicians added their own verses, their own instruments, their own interpretations of the original melody. And the workers, the men who actually built these cathedrals, they lived lives we can barely imagine. Stonemasons weren't wealthy, but they weren't poor either. They occupied a middle tier of medieval society, respected for their skill but still subject to the whims of bishops and kings. Most worked seasonally. Spring through autumn were the building months when weather allowed construction. Winter brought freezes that stopped work entirely. During those cold months, masons might return to their home villages, work on smaller projects, or travel to warmer regions where construction continued year-round. Life on a cathedral construction site was dangerous. Scaffolding collapsed. Ropes snapped. Stones fell from great heights. Men slipped from ledges or were crushed by swinging blocks. Accidents were so common that many cathedrals included small chapels specifically for injured workers to pray in. Death wasn't unusual, and when a mason died, his tools were often passed to his son or apprentice, carrying forward not just the craft, but the literal instruments of the trade. The social structure on a construction site was rigid. At the top sat the master mason, answering only to the bishop or the chapter of canons who funded the project. Below him were the master craftsmen, experienced masons who oversaw specific sections. Below them were journeymen, skilled workers who had completed their apprenticeships but hadn't yet achieved master status. And at the bottom were the apprentices, boys as young as 12 who spent years learning by watching, sweeping, hauling, and occasionally being allowed to make the simplest cuts under close supervision. But there was also a sense of community. These men worked together for years, sometimes decades. They ate together, drank together, argued, joked and mourned together when accidents claimed one of their own. Guilds provided a safety net, offering support to widows, caring for orphans, and ensuring that a mason who grew too old to work wasn't left to starve. Let's talk about the actual construction techniques, because this is where medieval ingenuity truly shines. Building a cathedral required solving problems that would challenge even modern engineers. How do you lift a 10-ton stone block 100 feet into the air without a crane? The answer, very carefully and with a lot of rope. Medieval builders used a device called a treadwheel crane. Picture a giant hamster wheel mounted vertically. Men walked inside the wheel, their weight turning a drum that wound a rope, slowly lifting the stone. It was exhausting, dangerous work. A single mistake, one frayed rope, one missed step, could send the stone plummeting, likely killing anyone below. Once the stone reached the right height, masons guided it into place using wooden levers and their own strength. Precision was everything. A block that didn't fit perfectly had to be lowered, recarved and lifted again. Imagine doing that dozens of times a day, every day, for decades. Then there were the vaults, those soaring curved ceilings that make cathedrals feel like glimpses of heaven. Building a stone vault was an act of controlled chaos. First, carpenters constructed a massive wooden framework called centering. This temporary structure supported the stones until the vault was complete. Masons then laid stones in a precise pattern, starting from the edges and working toward the centre. The keystone, the final stone at the top, locked everything in place. Once it was set, the centering could be removed, and if everything was done correctly, the vault held itself up through compression. If something was done incorrectly, well, the whole thing collapsed, usually spectacularly. And when vaults collapsed, they didn't just fall, they exploded, sending stones, dust and debris through the entire structure. It's a miracle more cathedrals didn't kill their builders. Flying buttresses, those iconic external supports that define Gothic architecture, were another engineering marvel. They weren't just decorative, they were essential. The taller and thinner cathedral walls became, the more outward force the vaults exerted. Without something to counter that force, the walls would bow outward and collapse. Flying buttresses channeled that force down and away from the walls, allowing builders to create the soaring, light-filled spaces that make Gothic cathedrals so breathtaking. But designing and building them required deep understanding of physics. Medieval masons didn't have mathematical formulas or computer models. They worked by intuition, experience, and sometimes trial and error. Occasionally, catastrophic error. Which brings us to one of the most dramatic aspects of cathedral construction, the collapses. Because yes, sections of cathedrals fell down with alarming regularity. The choir vault at Beauvais Cathedral collapsed in 1284, just 12 years after completion. The central tower at Ely Cathedral collapsed in 1322. The spire at Malmesbury Abbey collapsed in the 1500s. The south transept at York Minster partially collapsed in 1407. These weren't gentle failures, they were apocalyptic events, tons of stone crashing down in clouds of dust, destroying years of work in seconds. Sometimes the collapses killed workers, sometimes they happened at night or during periods when the site was empty, sparing lives but devastating morale. When a vault fell, it wasn't just a construction setback, it was seen as a spiritual crisis. Had God withdrawn his favour? Had someone committed a sin that cursed the project? Was the design itself an act of hubris, reaching too high, too proud? But here's what's remarkable. They rebuilt, every time. A collapse that might have ended a modern project was seen as a challenge to overcome. The vault fell? Fine. We'll build it again, stronger this time. The tower collapsed. We'll design a better one. This resilience, this refusal to give up, defined medieval cathedral building. These were men who believed they were constructing houses for God himself. Giving up wasn't an option. Now let's talk about the glass. The stained glass windows that fill cathedrals with kaleidoscopic light weren't just art. They were theology made visible, stories told in colour and light for a population that couldn't read. Creating these windows was its own specialised craft, passed down through families of glaziers who guarded their techniques jealously. The process began with sand, the purer the better. Sand was mixed with potash or soda and heated in furnaces to temperatures that would make modern glassblowers sweat. The molten glass was coloured by adding metal oxides, cobalt for blue, copper for green, gold for red, manganese for purple. Red glass was the most difficult and expensive to produce, which is why it appears less frequently than blue or green. Once cooled, the glass was cut into pieces following a design drawn on a whitewashed table. Each piece was then painted with enamel details, faces, hands, clothing folds, and fired again to fuse the paint to the glass. Finally, the pieces were assembled using strips of lead called cames, forming panels that were installed in the window openings. A single large rose window could take years to complete, and cost as much as a small village's annual income. But the effect was worth it. When sunlight poured through those windows, the interior of the cathedral transformed into a glowing jewel box, light dancing across the stone in ever-shifting patterns. For medieval worshippers, most of whom lived in dark, cramped homes, stepping into a cathedral filled with coloured light must have felt like entering paradise itself. And the windows weren't just beautiful, they were educational. Illiterate peasants who couldn't read the Bible could look at the windows and see the stories, the life of Christ, the martyrdom of saints, scenes from the Old Testament. Each window was a sermon in glass. This is why guilds competed to donate windows. A window featuring St. Peter might be sponsored by the Fishmongers Guild. A window showing St. Joseph the Carpenter might be given by the Carpenters Guild. Each window bore the guild's symbols, a form of medieval advertising. We donated this. Remember us. But maintaining these windows was a never-ending battle. Glass is fragile. Storm damage, accidents, vandalism. Panels cracked or shattered and had to be replaced. Over centuries, windows were repaired so many times that original medieval glass became mixed with later replacements. Some cathedrals today contain glass from 6 or 7 different centuries, all jumbled together, making it nearly impossible to determine what the original designers intended. Let's shift our focus now to the people who didn't build the cathedrals, but whose lives revolved around them. The clergy, the bishops, the canons, the priests. These men weren't just spiritual leaders. They were project managers, fundraisers, and politicians. A bishop overseeing cathedral construction had to balance multiple competing demands. Keep the masons working, which required steady money. Keep the local nobility happy, which required flattery and favours. Keep the pope satisfied, which required orthodoxy and obedience. And keep the townspeople from rioting, which required not taxing them into starvation to pay for construction. It was a delicate dance, and many bishops failed. Some bishops were genuinely devout, seeing the cathedral as their life's work and God's glory. Others were political appointees who cared more about their own power than architecture. A generous, committed bishop could accelerate construction dramatically. A stingy or distracted bishop could stall progress for decades. This is why the same cathedral might see rapid growth under one bishop, then complete stagnation under his successor. The building's fate was tied to the personality of whoever wore the mitre. And then there were the canons, the priests who served in the cathedral. They lived in the close, a walled precinct surrounding the cathedral, and their daily lives were governed by strict routines. Prayers at dawn, services throughout the day, meals in the refectory, sleep in the dormitory. They watched the cathedral grow around them, year by year, stone by stone. For many canons, the construction was a backdrop to their entire lives. They remembered when the choir was just scaffolding. They watched the nave rise column by column. They attended the dedication of each new chapel, each new altar. And when they grew old and died, they were buried in the cathedral they had served, their bones resting beneath the stones that took generations to place. There's a strange melancholy to this. Imagine being a canon in 1250. You're 20 years old, newly ordained, assigned to a cathedral that's half built. You watch it grow slowly for 60 years. You watch masons come and go. You watch bishops rise and fall. You watch the town around the cathedral change, grow, sometimes burn and be rebuilt. And when you die in 1310, an old man, the cathedral still isn't finished. The west facade is incomplete. The towers are stumps. The spire exists only in drawings. You gave your entire life to this building and you never saw it whole. But here's the beautiful part. You didn't need to. Because you believed, truly believed, that the cathedral would stand for eternity. That long after your bones turned to dust, pilgrims would still come, prayers would still echo off those stones, and God would still dwell in the space you helped create. That belief, that faith in something larger than yourself, larger than your own lifetime, that's what made the centuries-long construction possible. Let's talk about the pilgrims, because cathedrals weren't just architectural achievements. They were spiritual destinations. Medieval Europe was crisscrossed with pilgrimage routes, and cathedrals were the jewels along those paths. A cathedral that housed the relics of a famous saint could attract thousands of pilgrims annually, each one bringing donations, purchasing candles, paying for prayers, and spending money in the town. This created a powerful economic incentive to build the most impressive cathedral possible. A magnificent building attracted more pilgrims. More pilgrims meant more money. More money meant more construction. It was a self-reinforcing cycle, and bishops understood this perfectly. Pilgrims came for many reasons. Some sought healing, believing that proximity to a saint's relics could cure illness. Others came to fulfill a vow made in desperation during a crisis. Still others came seeking forgiveness for sins, hoping that a pilgrimage would cleanse their souls. And some came simply because everyone else was going, and they didn't want to be left out. Pilgrimage was the medieval equivalent of tourism, A rare opportunity to leave your village, see the wider world and claim a bit of adventure. When pilgrims arrived, they marvelled at the cathedrals. For most, it was the largest building they'd ever seen, larger than their entire village. The height, the space, the light, it was overwhelming. Some fell to their knees weeping. Others stood frozen, staring upward, trying to comprehend the scale. And the clergy knew exactly how to manage this reaction. Pilgrims were guided through the cathedral in specific routes, designed to maximise awe and encourage donations, past the chapels with their glittering altars, past the tombs of nobles and bishops, and finally to the reliquary, where the sacred bones or clothing of a saint rested in a jewelled container. Here pilgrims prayed, wept, left offerings, and purchased tokens to prove they'd been there, badges, medallions, tiny ampulla filled with holy water, the medieval version of souvenirs. But pilgrimage also had a dark side. Unscrupulous clergy sold fake relics, splinters of wood claimed to be from the true cross, teeth allegedly from St. Peter, vials of the Virgin Mary's milk. The trade in relics was vast and deeply corrupt, and yet the pilgrims believed. They had to believe, because if the relics were fake, if the miracles were lies, then what was the point of their suffering, their long journeys, their sacrifices? Now let's address one of the strangest aspects of medieval cathedral construction, the anonymity. We don't know the names of most of the people who built these structures. Oh, we know some of the master masons. A few signed their work or were mentioned in records. But the vast majority, the thousands of stonemasons, carpenters, labourers, apprentices, they're ghosts, nameless, forgotten. We walk through cathedrals marvelling at the work, but we have no idea whose hands carved this column, whose sweat soaked into that stone, whose blood stained the scaffolding when an accident occurred. They left no written records, no diaries, no letters, just the stone itself, silent and enduring. This wasn't accidental. Medieval culture didn't celebrate individual achievement the way we do. The work was for God, not for personal glory. Signing your name to a carving was considered prideful, even sinful. The cathedral was meant to direct attention upward, toward heaven, not toward the craftsman who built it. And yet, if you look closely, you can find small rebellions against this anonymity, hidden carvings, tiny faces tucked into the shadows of a capital, a mason's mark scratched into a stone, a simple symbol meaning, I was here, I did this. These marks weren't meant to be seen. They were private declarations, messages left for God, or perhaps for other masons who would understand. A secret language of pride and craftsmanship carved into stone. There's something deeply moving about discovering these marks. A thumbprint pressed into mortar 800 years ago. A crude drawing of a face on a stone that hasn't seen sunlight since the Middle Ages. These tiny traces connect us directly to the people who built these cathedrals, reminding us that they were real, that they lived, that they mattered. Let's talk about the dangers, because construction sites were lethal. We've mentioned collapses, but there were dozens of other ways to die. Falling from scaffolding was the most common. Medieval scaffolding was lashed together with rope and hope, swaying in the wind, creaking ominously. Men worked on narrow planks dozens of feet above the ground with no safety equipment. A moment of inattention, a rotten board, a gust of wind, and they fell. Some survived with broken bones. Most didn't. Stones dropped from above crushed skulls and shattered ribs. Ropes snapped, sending blocks plummeting. Chisels slipped, slashing hands and faces. Infections from minor cuts killed as surely as major injuries. Medieval medicine had no antibiotics, no concept of germ theory. A dirty wound could fester, turning gangrenous, leading to amputation or death. And amputations were done without anaesthesia. A saw, a leather strap to bite on, and prayers. Lung disease was another killer. Stone dust filled the air constantly. Masons inhaled it for decades, their lungs slowly clogging, their breathing growing laboured. There was no name for silicosis in the Middle Ages, but masons knew that men who carved stone often died young, coughing blood. Lead poisoning affected glaziers who worked with lead cames. The fumes from furnaces, the handling of molten glass, the constant exposure to toxic materials all took their toll. Winters brought their own dangers: frostbite, hypothermia, slips on icy scaffolding. Work continued in all but the worst weather, because every day construction stopped meant another day before completion, another day that donations might dry up, another day that death might claim a sponsor. Despite these dangers, men kept working. Why? Partly because they had no choice. It was their livelihood, their identity, their place in the world. But also because they believed in the work. They believed that building a house for God was worth the risk, that their suffering had meaning, that their labour honoured something greater than themselves. This belief sustained them through the cold, the danger, the exhaustion. And when they died, they were buried in cemeteries adjacent to the cathedral, their bones resting in the shadow of the building they gave their lives to create. Now let's talk about the towns that grew around these cathedrals. Because cathedrals didn't just dominate the skyline, they shaped entire urban landscapes. A cathedral attracted wealth, people, trade, power. Markets sprang up in the cathedral square, inns opened to house pilgrims, shops sold religious trinkets, scribes set up stalls to write letters for the illiterate, money changers did business in the shadows. The cathedral became the economic engine of the town, and everyone benefited, or at least tried to. But this also created conflict. Who controlled the cathedral close? The church or the town? Who collected taxes from the pilgrims? Who maintained order when crowds grew unruly? These questions sparked bitter disputes, sometimes lasting decades, occasionally erupting into violence. Towns competed with each other through their cathedrals. If your rival city's cathedral had a taller spire, that was intolerable. Plans were drawn up for an even taller spire. Funds were raised. Work began. Never mind that your existing tower was barely stable. Never mind that engineers warned it was impossible. Pride demanded that your cathedral be the tallest, the grandest, the most impressive. This competition drove innovation, but it also drove disasters. Towers collapsed, spires toppled, engineers pushed the limits of what stone could do, and sometimes stone pushed back. Let's turn now to the symbols hidden in these cathedrals. Because medieval builders embedded meaning into every detail, the floor plan wasn't arbitrary. Most cathedrals are laid out in the shape of a cross, the arms forming the transepts, the long nave forming the body, the altar at the head. Walking through a cathedral meant walking through the body of Christ. The orientation mattered too. The altar was placed at the eastern end, facing Jerusalem, the rising sun symbolising resurrection. The main entrance faced west, where the sun set, symbolising the world of sin and darkness that worshippers left behind when entering. Even the number of columns had meaning. 12 columns might represent the apostles, 7 the days of creation, 3 the Trinity. The carvings were a visual encyclopedia. A single capital might show the story of Adam and Eve, their sin, their expulsion from paradise. Another might depict a saint's martyrdom, the moment of suffering transformed into eternal glory. Gargoyles, those grotesque creatures perched on roofs, weren't just drainage spouts. They were guardians, warding off evil, embodying the sins and demons that the cathedral's sacred space kept at bay. Looking at them was meant to remind you that sin lurked everywhere, ready to pounce on the unwary. Even the proportions were symbolic. The height of the nave, the width of the transept, the diameter of the rose window, all calculated according to ratios believed to reflect divine harmony. The cathedral was a sermon in stone, every element teaching, warning, inspiring. For the medieval mind, nothing was random. Everything pointed toward God. But let's not romanticize too much. Cathedral construction was also messy, political, and deeply human. Bishops fought with kings over funding. Masons argued with canons over designs. Towns rioted when taxes grew too heavy. Corruption was rampant. Donations disappeared into private pockets. Relics were faked. Indulgences were sold to finance construction, a practice that would eventually help spark the Protestant Reformation. The dream of building for God's glory often collided with greed, ambition, and pride. And yet, despite the flaws, despite the corruption and conflict, the cathedrals rose. Because even flawed humans can create something transcendent. Even greed and pride can accidentally serve beauty. The cathedrals weren't built by saints. They were built by people, complicated, contradictory people, who somehow managed to create buildings that still take our breath away 800 years later. Let's talk about what happened after the Middle Ages ended. The Renaissance brought new aesthetics. Gothic was suddenly old-fashioned, even barbaric. These soaring vertical lines were replaced by classical proportions, domes, symmetry. Some unfinished cathedrals were completed in Renaissance or Baroque styles, creating jarring mismatches. A Gothic nave topped with a Baroque dome, a medieval facade grafted onto a classical body. Purists hated it. But for the builders of the time, it made sense. Why finish in an outdated style when you could showcase modern taste? Then came the Reformation, and suddenly cathedrals became targets. Protestants saw them as symbols of Catholic excess, monuments to idolatry. In England, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries stripped many cathedrals of their wealth. Statues were smashed, windows shattered, reliquaries looted. Some cathedrals were partially demolished, their stone carted away for other buildings. Others were repurposed, turned into Anglican churches, their Catholic identity erased. In France, the Revolution brought even more destruction. Notre Dame was nearly demolished. Its spire was torn down, its statues beheaded. The interior was used as a warehouse. For a time it seemed the age of cathedrals was over, but these medieval giants would crumble into romantic ruins. But the 19th century brought a revival. The Gothic revival movement, led by figures like Augustus Pugin and Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, rediscovered the beauty of medieval architecture. Cathedrals were restored, sometimes overzealously. Viollet-le-Duc's restoration of Notre Dame added elements that never existed in the Middle Ages, his own interpretation of what a perfect Gothic cathedral should be. Some praised him as a saviour, others called him a vandal. The debate continues. But his work, and that of others like him, ensured that cathedrals survived into the modern era. They were cleaned, repaired, stabilised. Tourism became their new economic engine. Pilgrims were replaced by curious visitors, cameras instead of prayer books, but the buildings endured. The 20th century brought new challenges. 2 world wars turned Europe into a battlefield. Cathedrals were bombed, shelled, burned. Coventry Cathedral was reduced to a shell. Cologne Cathedral survived dozens of bombing, raids, standing miraculously amid rubble. Reims Cathedral, damaged in World War I, was restored between the wars, only to be threatened again in World War II. Each time, they were rebuilt. Proof that these structures meant something beyond religion, beyond architecture. They were symbols of continuity, resilience, identity. And then in 2019, the world watched in horror as Notre Dame burned. The spire collapsed in flames. The roof, that magnificent medieval timber framework, was consumed in hours. For a moment it seemed like 800 years of history would vanish in a single night. But the stone held, the walls stood, the towers survived, and within hours pledges poured in to rebuild. Because Notre Dame wasn't just a building, it was a monument to human determination, to the generations who built it stone by stone, to the belief that some things are worth preserving no matter the cost. Let's return now to the men who built these cathedrals, because their story deserves to be told completely. These weren't faceless workers. They were individuals with hopes, fears, families, lives. A young apprentice starting on a cathedral might dream of becoming a master mason, of designing his own cathedral someday. He learned by watching, by making mistakes, by enduring the mockery of journeymen who remembered when they were equally clumsy. He slept in shared barracks, ate simple meals, earned barely enough to survive. But he also learned a trade that would feed him for life, that would connect him to a brotherhood stretching across Europe, that would give him pride and purpose. A journeyman, having completed his apprenticeship, travelled from site to site, honing his skills, learning new techniques. He might spend a year in Chartres, 2 years in Rouen, a season in Salisbury. Each cathedral taught him something new. Each master mason had his own methods. And when the journeyman finally became a master himself, he carried all of that accumulated knowledge, becoming a living library of architectural wisdom. An old mason, too frail to climb scaffolding, might sit in the workshop training apprentices, carving delicate details or simply telling stories. Stories of the great collapse at Beauvais. Stories of the master who designed a vault so perfect it seemed to float. Stories of the winter when the river froze and they couldn't get stone for 6 months. These stories preserved knowledge, passed down techniques, and bound the masons into a continuous tradition that spanned centuries. And what of the women? Because yes, women were involved, though history often forgets them. Masons' wives and daughters cooked for the workers, washed their clothes, sometimes tended small gardens to supplement the site's food supply. Some women learned trades adjacent to construction, embroidering liturgical vestments, weaving tapestries, preparing the inks and paints used for manuscripts and decorations. A few women even became patrons, wealthy widows who donated funds, noble women who commissioned chapels. Their contributions were real, even if their names were rarely recorded. Children grew up on construction sites, playing among the stone blocks, watching their fathers work. For them, the cathedral was a playground, a classroom, a glimpse of their future. Many followed their fathers into the trade, apprenticing as soon as they were strong enough to lift a chisel. Others found different paths, but all carried memories of the cathedral throughout their lives. The smell of fresh-cut stone, the sound of mallets ringing, the sight of their father high on the scaffolding, small against the massive stones. Now let's address a question that haunts anyone studying cathedral construction. Was it worth it? The suffering, the cost, the lives lost, the generations spent. Was building these monuments to God worth the human price? There's no easy answer. From one perspective, cathedrals represent a staggering misallocation of resources. The money spent on a single cathedral could have fed thousands. The labour could have built homes, bridges, infrastructure that directly improved lives. Instead, resources were poured into buildings that served primarily symbolic purposes, structures designed to glorify God and impress neighbours. Seen this way, cathedrals are monuments to vanity disguised as piety. But from another perspective, cathedrals represent humanity at its best. They show what we can achieve when we work toward a goal larger than ourselves, when we sacrifice for something we believe in, when we create beauty not for profit but for its own sake. They prove that humans aren't purely selfish, that we can delay gratification, that we can start projects knowing we'll never see them finished. And the cathedrals have endured. They've sheltered millions, inspired countless artists, preserved knowledge, and stood as symbols of hope during the darkest periods of history. In that sense, perhaps they were worth every sacrifice. But here's what's most important. The people who built them believed it was worth it. For them, there was no higher calling than creating a house for God. Their suffering wasn't meaningless. It was devotion made physical. Their labour wasn't exploitation. It was offering. Whether we agree with their beliefs or not, we must respect the sincerity of their faith and the magnitude of what they accomplished. Let's talk about one more cathedral, one that exemplifies the multi-generational nature of these projects better than any other. Ulmer Minster in Germany. Construction began in 1377, with the foundation stone laid and ambitious plans drawn for a church with the tallest spire in the world. Work progressed steadily for a century. The nave was completed, the choir rose, the towers began climbing toward the sky, and then, in 1543, construction stopped. Not because of a collapse or funding crisis, but because the Reformation shifted priorities. The half-built church stood for over 300 years, its towers truncated stumps, a reminder of unfinished ambitions. It wasn't until 1844 that work resumed. By then the original plans had been lost and rediscovered. The original vision had been forgotten and relearned. The techniques of medieval masons had to be studied and recreated by modern craftsmen. And finally, in 1890, 513 years after construction began, Ulmer Minster was completed. Its spire rose 530 feet, making it the tallest church tower in the world. The final stone was laid by workers who stood on scaffolding above stones placed by men who had been dead for 500 years. Think about that. 5 centuries, 20 generations. Wars, plagues, revolutions, all came and went. And through it all, Ulmer Minster waited, patient and silent, until finally the vision was realised. Standing in a medieval cathedral today is a strange experience. The stones are old, ancient, but they don't feel dead. They hum with the memory of everyone who touched them, every mason who carved them, every labourer who hauled them, every worshipper who prayed beside them. Run your hand along a column and you're touching something that dozens of people spent years creating. Look up at the vaulting and you're seeing the result of calculations done by men whose names we'll never know. These buildings are time machines, not in the science fiction sense, but in a deeper way. They collapse centuries into a single moment. Stand in the nave and you're standing where medieval pilgrims stood, where Reformation mobs raged, where Napoleonic soldiers camped, where survivors of 2 world wars came seeking solace. The stones witnessed all of it, and will witness whatever comes next. In our modern age of instant gratification, of projects measured in months and years, there's something almost incomprehensible about medieval cathedral construction. The idea of starting something you'll never see finished. The patience required to work on a single building for your entire life. Knowing your children will continue after you. Knowing your grandchildren might still be working when they grow old. We've lost that capacity. We demand results, timelines, completion dates. We can't imagine devoting ourselves to something that transcends our own lifespan. But perhaps that's what makes cathedrals so important now. They remind us that humanity is capable of thinking in centuries, of sacrificing for the future, of creating beauty that outlasts empires. They tell us that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that our actions echo across time, that what we build today might still stand 1,000 years from now. In a world obsessed with the immediate, cathedrals whisper a different truth. Some things are worth waiting for, some things are worth suffering for, some things take time. The men who built these cathedrals didn't know the world we live in now. They couldn't imagine electricity, airplanes or computers, but they knew something we're in danger of forgetting. That greatness requires patience. That beauty demands sacrifice. That faith, whether in God or in the future, can move stones heavier than any machine. And so the cathedrals stand, silent witnesses to centuries of human endeavour. Monuments not just to God, but to the generations who believed in something greater than themselves. Stone by stone, year by year, lifetime by lifetime, they rose from the earth and reached toward heaven. And though the hands that built them have long since turned to dust, the stones remain, speaking a truth that echoes across the centuries. Some things are worth building slowly, some dreams take generations to realise, and some acts of faith are measured not in years, but in the stone that endures long after we're gone.